Hi, I'm Laura.
Hey, I'm Steffen, and you're listening to Attributed, a podcast library by Dreamdata.
The purpose of it is to store and share all the knowledge that we have gathered across Dreamdata employees through our LinkedIn Lives, podcasts, and webinars.
The typical topics you'll find here can be stuff like marketing,
Sales,
B2B ads,
operations,
social selling, maybe. Welcome, everybody, to today's Attributed session, again brought to you by Dreamdata. Today, I'm very excited to have Ted McKenna joining me today to talk about not just kind of ideas about what works or like gut feelings, but Ted is actually part of a group of people who analyze 2.5 million sales calls to find out what's stopping the deals from landing in your pocket or going too close to one. And if there's something we really like in B2B marketing, it is winning customers. And what we're going to be trying to explore today is to bridge the gap between B2B sales and marketing and to explore what is the findings that Ted and his team has found for what works in B2B sales. And then we're going to try to reflect a little bit upon how we as B2B marketers can learn from this and set salespeople up in the right positions, because if there's no closed won deals, there's no return on ad spend, there's no marketing ROI either. So we really, really need to understand what is it that makes sales teams win their deals or not. So Ted, I'm super excited to have you join us here today. I discovered the JOLT effect from just several different salespeople that I respect posting about
Mhm.
the book. So that told me there's definitely something here that would be interesting for our audience to learn about. But for people who've never met you or never heard about you or the JOLT effect
Mhm.
or your company, it's companies, right? Like,
Mhm.
can you just give us the 2-3 minute fly into to Ted McKenna and your world?
Sure. Well, thanks for having me on the show. Excited to be here, and I typically spend most of my time with sales leaders, so it's a nice, refreshing moment to be able to just spend some time with marketers only. So yeah, so researcher by trade. I go back a ways with my co-author Matt Dixon, who many of your audience members might know, who's a co-author of the Challenger Sale, Challenger Customer. That was back in our days at a company called CEB, where we studied best practices of sales and marketing organizations. And so I was part of those research teams, part of the team, running portions of that business. And about 4 or 5 years ago, Matt and I decided it's actually right in the heart of COVID, which nobody likes to remember or think about. But for us as researchers, it was this really interesting moment because all of a sudden, overnight, there were all these calls, these sales visits, these calls that typically happen outside of our purview, in coffee shops or offices around the world, that all of a sudden we're on Zoom or Teams or some other platform like that, that we had this moment in time that we could study sales at scale in ways we never could have previously. So we pounced on that opportunity. We use machine learning and some AI technology as a way to study at scale all these conversations, categorizing all sorts of things. And that's kind of what we do. Our business is focused in on what are high performing sellers doing differently than their peers? What are they figuring out about how buyers are shifting, how they're purchasing? In the days of Challenger, the big shift we talked about is highly informed buyers placing us into boxes and pushing us into commoditized places. How do we break out of that? And Jolt led us down this path of learning about indecision and hesitation, what happens when the buyer is gripped by that. And so that's where we find ourselves. And now we've got a company that helps teams overcome that.
That's so interesting, and it's such a pivotal moment in time when like meetings used to be something very offline where you had to sit in on before it becoming something digital that we actually have a digital footprint for. And now with these days, it's so easy to get a transcribe of a sales call. You get the video
Yeah.
recording, and soon all these platforms will have LMs that helps us analyze and understand all these sales calls. But what were so you had the technical realization, and now all these meetings are digital. What were the kind of leading questions that you kind of had in mind when starting to analyze all these digital meetings?
Yeah, look, we build a predictive model, and we base that off of the outcome of, did this sale end up closing or not, whether it was soon after that or months after that. So we were looking at CRM data and comparing it against that, and then looking at high performers and trying to contrast that. But we went in with an open mind and trying to really understand what really drives that outcome from a sales perspective. I will tell you, from the beginning, in many ways, the study turned into this really interesting study of losses more than wins. I sort of regard this as maybe the world's biggest study of losses ever conducted, because we found
Important.
more that was where the insight really was, because what we started to see were losses in places we didn't expect to see losses. Where the buyer was very excited about what was happening, that they seemed really inclined to make the purchase. They may have even expressed intent to purchase or selected the vendor, and the seller was doing all the things you would have expected or hoped that they
Mm.
might do, driving urgency against that need and really helping them understand their problem, and yet they still got stuck. That for us was an interesting moment, I guess, in our study, where
Yeah.
there's something here that we really need to kind of dig into.
It's maybe worth just zooming in on, I think you mentioned it as one of the videos on your website as well, that the amount of deals that just goes lost because companies end up not making a decision. Like, it's such a insane, I think in the video on your website, you say somewhere between 40 and 60% of the accounts that are on the right path ends with no decision.
Yeah, well, whether it's on the right path or wrong path, our data would tell you anywhere between 40 and 60% of deals are lost to the buyer deciding to do nothing at all. Now, some of that does break down into them deciding, what we're doing today is superior to what you've proposed, or I just prefer not to change. That we would call a sort of a preference for the status quo. They prefer not to change, but that really is a decision. Turns out 56% of that no decision is due to this indecision, which is really rooted in this fear of failure. We can unpack that in a little greater depth. But you're right, there are all these sort of addressable, if you will, losses sitting in our pipeline. They should be really efficient, rather inexpensive ways for us to improve. If you think about it from a marketing standpoint, it's far cheaper to close more of that existing
Yeah.
pipeline than it
Yeah.
is to go find and pay for new pipeline, right?
Yeah, and like I have to ask, why don't these deals move forward? What are people doing wrong? Why are they not maintaining progress on these deals?
Yeah. Well, some of it, I mean, a lot of it actually is due to just the people involved. I mean, look, at the end of the day, what we found, and this I don't think is all that surprising, but we don't think about this when we think about sales and we think about especially businesses making decisions, which I think typically we assume that they're very rationally minded individuals who are making decisions about budgets and ROI and business cases and what have you. And it's easy to lose sight about the fact that these are a group of people and individuals. And it turns out indecision is a very human oriented emotion. And it's something we all are susceptible to. We talk a lot in our training programs to people about how this affects us individually as we go to make purchases. And you can't then be surprised it's affecting your buyers as well. There is a story, though, about how the sellers typically will make this worse, not better, and that's a big part of one of the big
Yeah.
findings of the study is that often when the buyer, I think especially when the buyer seems rather excited, and this manifests in, "Hey, this demo was amazing," or, "Can I have more of these demos? I'd love my colleagues to come on," and it feels like they're very excited, and they say, "You know what? This is something we absolutely should do." And then they start to go kind of cold. They start to kind of backtrack. They start to can't get them on the phone. They're not really giving you
Yeah.
much information. And
Terrible.
what most sellers do in that situation, the reason and they make it worse is because they misinterpret that hesitation. They assume that that hesitation is rooted in a lack of persuasion. Their sort of working assumption is, well, they must not want it enough. I mean, they're telling me that they want it, but if they really wanted it, they'd be showing up to these calls and they'd be willing to
Mm.
put time on the calendar and they'd be making this business case and they'd be advocating on behalf of this. So they must not want it enough. And so what they do is they double down on it. They go back to that case for change and they really try to throw a bunch of fear on top of that decision and try to drive urgency against it. And what we found in our study is that actually backfires more often than not. More than 80% of the time, actually, it backfires and makes things worse. You actually make it more likely the buyer makes no decision at all. Now there's some psychology that's involved there, but so it's both it's happening both because this is just the nature of things and this is how people kind of get overwhelmed as you go to make types of decisions. But then also we make things worse when we go to engage with them from a sales perspective.
I guess what I'm looking for here is the right path. Then, so there's this fear of that the project is not going to work out, or the champion is not really doing the moves that he promised you to do. What is the kind of the delicate right way to kind of treat that silence or ghosting period then?
Yeah. Well, I think first is to recognize it and understand what's actually happening, right? Because I guess for so long we've all assumed that in sales, our primary or maybe even our only job is to beat the status quo,
Yeah.
is to convince that buyer that change is necessary. And so I have one tool and one job, and I just take that hammer and I hammer that nail every single time. What we found in the study is there are two reasons that buyers decide to do nothing. One is, in fact, their preference for a status quo, but that's only 44% of the reason. 56% of it is this, it's rooted in indecision due to fear of failure. So we could see it in the data, right? We could see instances when the buyer completely wanted to change, had intent to change, had selected the vendor and still got stuck. But we couldn't yet explain why it was happening until we turned to a bunch of psychology and behavioral economics. We read decades worth of studies there. And one of the, I know actually Matt had the most of the tall task of doing some of that reading. He wouldn't wish it upon anyone. So we've summarized maybe some of it for the audience. And
Yeah.
there's a pretty well known phenomenon called omission bias that's rooted in work that Kahneman and Tversky did around prospect theory and loss
Yeah.
aversion. And most people are aware of it because, we're all sort of wired to want to avoid loss. This is why that sort of FOMO appeal, the fear of missing out appeal that we typically use as a way to drive desire and to drive momentum. That's why that works, because people don't want to miss out, right? They want that's a more powerful thing than even the desire to win. However, there's a wrinkle in the research that is really important for us to understand with respect to indecision, because turns out they actually found there's two different types of losses. So there's an error of omission. That is the one where I did not do something, and as a consequence, I missed out.
Yeah.
Right. So I didn't go to the party and I missed it. Right. Or I
Yeah. It
didn't
was
take
great.
this. I didn't jump
Crazy.
into this initiative and I didn't do it. Right.
You didn't
But
sign
there's also
Michael
this
Jordan.
error. Yes, exactly. That's right. Yes. As a Chicago Bulls fan, I was happy that the Bulls got him. But then there's an error of commission, which is I did do something.
Yeah.
It went horribly wrong and I got blamed. Right. So it's a very personal form of loss. And what we found, and they found actually, the phenomenon is that actually weighs heavier on us as individuals. It's something that we care more about, is avoiding those situations where if we were to do something or we have done something and we get blamed, I'd rather never go down that path again. And
Mm.
as buyers, that really, really weighs on us. So shorthand of this is that I fear messing up more than I do missing out.
Yeah.
Right. So your 10% discount matters far less to me than my job, right? Or the way that my peers look at me
Yeah. My
internally, or the
career.
political clout that I have. And
Yeah.
yes, absolutely. So that fear of messing up becomes a hugely important thing for sellers to be able to detect and handle. And then, of course, if they can, find ways to lessen it for the buyer throughout the process.
Yeah, and I guess just thinking it out loud, I guess that's a matter of demonstrating. Look, we have other clients just like you who have become very successful by saying yes, or it's social proof by here's our review page, and there's a lot of reviews you can see. You will not get fired by getting this product on board, or is it that kind of thing that you can kind of do to mitigate the commission fear?
There's a little bit of the social proof, yes, if positioned correctly. Although, you could argue that that just helps the incumbent more than anything else. So if you're the upstart brands, that doesn't really do you all that good, because it's easy to just run to the safe place there. But the
That's also
bigger issue, the bigger issue is, and there's a whole series of like personal psychological factors involved. Just some people are what psychologists call maximizers, who just always want the absolute best thing, and they have to constantly look for validation that they have the best thing. And so we tell our sellers in our training program, if you feel like you have a buyer who is a maximizer, just be careful, because they might never make a decision at all. That's just because who they are. But in the context of a purchase, though, when they go to buy something, B2B buyers, there's three specific fears that pop up. These are phenomenons that I think most organizations can identify with, and our research would tell you 87% of opportunities have these phenomenons happen. So first one is options overload. So over and above whether I want your product, even after I've decided I want to move forward, I then look at the sea of options, all these choices and paths that I can head down, whether it's implementation timeframes, integrations, onboarding, users to be involved, all sorts of things that I have to make decisions about. And buyers struggle to make trade-offs. They struggle to make sense of what's better and for what reasons. They feel like, gosh, if I go down this path, I might regret it. Or if I go down that path, I might regret it. So easier to just not do
Mm,
anything.
yeah.
So that's one big fear. Next big fear is information overload. So here the buyer, not very rationally, believes that they lack enough information to make a decision, that they haven't yet done enough homework. And most salespeople find this kind of to be crazy because, of course, we all have access to tons of information.
Mm.
And of course, as part of most sales processes, I'm sure all the marketers in your line have done great jobs of putting white papers in the hands, case studies and whatnot in the hands
Yeah.
of their sales team, and they're sharing those things. So why it's not rational is because it's not because they haven't gotten any information, but they feel like, gosh, there must be some surprise hidden around the corner. And until I find that surprise, I need to
Yeah.
keep digging. I need to
Yeah.
keep looking for that. So they want to dot every I, cross
Yeah.
every T before they're ready to move forward. Then the last one is this expectations overload, where the buyer feels like no matter how many assurances that you give me, we're going to be the one exception, and outcomes remain still very uncertain, very variable in nature. And so I worry that the expectations for us to do this outpace our ability to achieve it. So most buyers have one of those three things, sometimes multiple of those things, and it can differ by person inside the organization. So one stakeholder might fear one, another stakeholder might feel another. And so it gets kind of complex in that respect.
Can you just repeat the last thing you said about expectations versus?
Yeah, so it's outcome uncertainty, right? So the buyer feels like, "Hey, you've given me a lot of assurance, but
Yeah.
those organizations, they're good at change. We stink at change. Like
Yeah.
we mess things up all the
Ah,
time." And
I see.
by the way, at the end of the day, there's one person's name on that DocuSign or Adobe sign, right? And so who's going to get blamed when this goes wrong? That's going to be me. So,
Yeah.
and I've seen things like this go wrong before as they're thinking, right? They've seen technology implementations go bad. They've seen it, and because those are
Absolutely.
hard, right?
Yeah.
And so that's actually, well, we can get into that. There's some earlier stage implications there, but that's kind of the root of their fear.
That's so interesting, and I can definitely, like, given all the sales conversation I've been in and we've been in our company, I can definitely recognize all of the scenarios that you're mentioning here. Am I too early to ask for the cure here? Or, like, I can definitely recognize all the 3 kind of buckets of
Yeah.
fear even when I buy things myself. I see these things. What is it that the good salesperson then do during the sales process to kind of mitigate this fear from growing from something small to something big that leads to no decision, I guess?
Yeah. Well, first we talk about, look, recognize it first, right? Be able to
Yeah.
spot it and understand it first, because two reasons. One, that notion of, hey, I've seen technology implementations go wrong, or I've seen these types of onboardings go awry, or I've seen, you know, content platforms get bought and nobody use them.
Mm.
That baggage they bring into the conversation weighs on people from the very first conversation that you have with them, right? So we don't have the luxury of waiting until after the buyer desires your product before we start treating indecision. So we've got to start early to do that.
So
That
is it
doesn't mean we don't.
asking preemptive questions? Have you been buying products like this before, where it didn't work out? What went wrong? Is it those types of questions you wanna be asking?
Yeah, I think there are diplomatic ways to discover it, to add to your discovery questions some of their experience with previous implementations or
Yeah.
with previous types of organizations there without, necessarily hinting at any potential issue there, right? But just trying to suss out their general mindset around these types of changes or their experience with it.
Yes.
But of course, the other reason to recognize it is because I don't want to mistreat it when it does occur. Because the first rule of thumb is don't do more damage when it does happen, right? At minimum, don't take that buyer who's already terrified, right? They're already terrified that they're going to mess up and throw more fear and more FUD on top of that. And that's where you start to entrench the buyer. They start to retreat a little bit because it's
Yeah.
like, God, I'm really terrified. So that's the first rule of thumb: is spot it, size it, understand that it's happening. And then from there, so JOLT is an acronym. It stands for the 4 key behaviors that we found in the study that high performers are doing differently than their peers. It's also meant to have double meaning, of course, right? We're trying to jolt the buyer out of their indecision and sort of past their indecision. So the J in the jolt is judging the level of indecision. I kind of covered that already. So how do I spot it? Because often, of course, buyers either aren't aware or aren't willing to admit that they're dealing with this indecision.
Yeah.
So how do we spot it and raise it? How do we understand it even when the buyer doesn't come out and just tell us, hey, I stink at making changes? It's like that doesn't
Yeah.
happen all that often. So we talk about the skills necessary to understand it. There's a skill we talk about called pings, which is essentially the seller using sonar as a way to understand, hey, what's happening underneath the surface of that water, right?
Yeah, I
Using
see.
pings as a way to raise that. So that's one thing you need to do. Now, in doing that, it's going to help me qualify that piece of business better, right? I'm going to understand more about not just their ability to buy, but their ability to make a decision. And that should also make my forecast more accurate in terms of the likelihood and the timing of them making the decision. So
Yeah.
there are many sort of like selfish reasons why, as a seller, I'd want to understand the nature of that indecision, the size of it, and whatnot. But of course, while I do that, I should learn more about the type of indecision that they're experiencing. And that's going to help me in my pursuit, because each one of the next three skills are well aligned to one of those three big fears. So the O in JOLT is offer a firm recommendation. And this is a skill that's particularly powerful in those situations when the buyer's stuck because they can't decide which path to head down, right? Do I go path A, path B? Do I start here? Do I start there?
Mm.
That's where a recommendation becomes a really powerful skill to indicate to that buyer that you're willing to shift some of that perceived blame from them to you,
Can you
right?
give an
If I
example
were
that
you,
does kind of what yeah, so you were just about to do it.
yeah. So this can be about recommending the path they're heading down, right? So this could be, hey, based on what you're trying to achieve, we need to think about redirecting that path in a different way. When we work with organizations that has success, they're kind of doing it like this versus that.
Mm.
But then also it's about the solution itself. So think about the proposal that I then go to write to them, right? How do I help them understand where to get started, what package is best, how best to, what not to do, right? So a recommendation is as much about what you tell them what they shouldn't be doing versus what they should be doing. And in doing so, you're quite literally reducing the fear of things that they could mess up
Yeah.
in that process. But there's a couple skills we talk about in the book: proactive guidance and advocacy. And a big part of this is the seller kind of putting their thumb on the scale, or their willingness anyway to put their thumb on the scale to say, you know what, if it were me, based on my experience or based on what we've heard from buyers like you, here's what I would go and do. Now, there's some technique involved to make sure the buyer understands where you're coming from, that they have agency in that choice and you're not making it for them. But it is an important element to make it firm and personal for that seller.
I was just thinking as you were saying these things, so there's the 3 buckets of fear. Are there any kind of metrics a salesperson can kind of pay attention to during the buying process that this is happening, either qualitatively or maybe even quantitatively?
Yeah, well, in general, I think there are quantitative measures you can see certainly at scale. So if I'm a marketing
Yeah,
leader or a
yeah.
sales leader and I'm trying to understand, under certain where are my losses and what's the size of potential indecision, you could look at cycle time metrics and days between sales stages, and you can look at stalled deals entirely, and then there are smaller things like excessive amounts of demo requests or things like that that indicate they're starting to spin their wheels.
Mm,
But from a seller perspective, I think this is often more qualitative than it is quantitative. I mean, you
yeah.
could surmise a little bit, hey, this deal's been open, twice as long as my standard sales
Mm,
process
yeah,
and or sales cycle, I should say. And so something might be amiss here. But typically, these are from an outcome standpoint, either the buyer is truly stuck or they're backtracking, right? They're going back on decisions we've already made. Pretty good indication that there's some degree of
yeah,
indecision,
yeah.
right? But from a options overload standpoint, which is your question, I think this is, you could start observing it. For example, let's say I make a recommendation to that point on backtracking, and a week later they ask for more detail on
Mm,
something that I didn't recommend.
yeah,
Again, pretty good indication they didn't accept my recommendation or feel good about that, right? If they seemed way overwhelmed, like they want everything. This is a tough thing for a seller. Like if your buyer wants everything you sell,
yeah,
your first instinct is, well, this is amazing. I'm going to sell this giant deal with everything
yeah,
I possibly could. The Jolt seller thinks maybe, but this also might indicate that they can't separate must haves from need to haves, or sorry, nice to haves versus must haves.
yes, that's a
And
nice
so
one.
consequently, they're going to get stuck at some point.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's a good sign that in fact, if they can't make those trade-offs, they're struggling to make that decision.
Ooh, I would love you just to say a bit more about that, Tenna, because I can definitely also recognize that scenario where they kind of think a lot of the things are sexy, but they don't come with a specific use case. This is the problem we need to solve. We're spending this much today. It needs to become 20% more effective or something like that. how do you guide the conversation to help them kind of narrow in that you can't have everything? You need to kind of decide on a few. I don't know if that's the
Yeah.
right way to express it, Ted.
Yeah, well, look, the primary issue you're trying to address as the seller is that the buyer stinks at trade-offs, right? They're not good at trying to understand what's better and for what reason. Like this isn't Amazon.com where you've got your filters and you've got little Amazon recommendations and you've got little Gantt charts for everything. Like that's not the way things work in B2B sales typically.
Mm,
So the seller's job is really to help them make those trade-offs and help them understand the relative context for, hey, if you were to go down this path, here's the benefit, but here's the drawback. If you go
yeah,
down this path, here's the benefit, here's the drawback. And it's easier said than done in certain circumstances because
yeah,
most B2B sales organizations have a lot of different potential directions they could be talking to the buyer. And this isn't just things they might buy, right? This is also just things the buyer might do post sale, right?
mm.
Who might they involve, the timeframes that might be involved, like start here versus there, like who do you train first on our product and so forth. This is all part of the decision the buyer's making.
I've continuously find it interesting that kind of the old school image of a salesperson, this like car dealer that kind of just has a quick pitch and then stuff works. It's just so wrong from what like real B2B sales is. You need to
Real
be
life experience. Yeah.
you need to be so smart. You need to know everything about the product. You have need to have seen all scenarios. You need to understand the crafts. You need to understand the JOLT effect. And it's just
Yeah,
kind of
that's
a
right.
marketer who gonna only observe the sales from the outside. You can really see it's such a craft, and there's so many details once you start drilling into the details of it.
Yeah, no, well, absolutely. So that I didn't ask you for that transition, but that actually gets us into the lack of information, which is that emotion. And in many ways, it can spread through the decision process, which is, let's say I catch the seller flat-footed on a question, or it seems like they're not really sure about which direction to go in, or it just feels like I'm kind of on my own unless I do all this homework, unless I make sure I understand it. I'm not being a good steward of my organization's resources, right? And
Yeah.
so I find it to be a burden on myself. And so they spin into analysis paralysis, right? Where they feel like they have to read everything and they have to know everything. These are the buyers that drive marketers nuts, right? Because they've given them all the case studies, but these are the buyers that feel like I have to read the entire user guide before I go to make the purchase. And it's like,
Yeah.
that's going to take a while. You're asking questions that we've had customers with us for 15 years. They've never asked these questions,
Yeah.
but it's this emotion that feels like I'm being left in the dark, right? There's some skeleton hidden in some closet that I haven't yet found. Now, the seller can make this a lot worse because the buyer comes in with this assumption that the seller's out to hide all the bad information and only position all the good information, right? There's this information asymmetry that the seller's taking advantage of, and in doing so, it heightens that buyer's fear, right? That, they're on one side, I'm on this side, I have to go and find this information. So one of the powerful things a seller can do there is effectively looking around corners on that buyer's behalf, right? Doing homework for them and
Mm.
demonstrating that, we've been down this path before. I know where this path goes.
Yeah.
And hey, you haven't thought to ask this question yet, but I did want to raise this because often buyers at this juncture do wonder about this. So I just want to get this out there on the table. And for the buyer, it feels like, oh gosh, like I'm not alone. This person is doing homework on my behalf. There's some relief involved there.
Yeah. Yeah. What does the buying committee look like for what's the decision making for this decision? Who's involved in the deal? Can I help you prepare for any of the internal meetings you need to go and have after you have had this conversation with me? I can definitely see that being as a really nice experience on the buying side of things.
Yeah, certainly there's an element of, hey, it's that old axiom of, this might be the first time you've ever bought something like this from us or from anyone,
Yeah.
but it's not the first time I've ever sold something like this. So part of this, we call this the skill owning the flow of information. Part of that can be about, effectively coaching the buyer about how to get through the purchase. So to your
Yeah.
point, who might need to be involved, when might they need to get pulled in, what information might need put in front of them. But also a lot of this is about making sure the buyer understands and has done like proper diligence. They feel like they're a fully informed purchaser before they jump into the process.
Yeah.
And so that's yes, it's about getting through the purchase, but it's also about making sure the buyer believes that, what, like they've thought through everything, right?
Mm.
They're thinking through these things on our behalf, and I don't have to worry so much
Yeah.
that there's some surprise in around the corner.
That's super interesting. Ted, I think like we should complete the jolt. So like you had the
Yes.
offering of advice, then there's the L and the T as well. What's coming after the offering?
Yeah, so starting to get in the L with the limiting the expiration. That's addressing that core fear the buyer has that don't have enough information, right? So the limiting the expiration is essentially the seller earning back trust and helping the buyer understand that, I've got your best interest in mind. There's a chapter in the book we call Becoming a Buyer's Agent, which is kind of the mentality and the mindset of that Jolt seller is, right? I've got your best interest in mind. I'm here to find ways to make sure that you're going to have a great experience. And so this involves the seller, it requires them to earn back a little trust early on. So we talk in our training programs about simple and more complex ways that you can earn back some trust, demonstrate credibility with the buyer.
Yeah.
But then the way that we run interactions matters quite a bit. It's either confidence inducing or confidence degrading. And it's really not so much confidence in the purchase as much as a comfort with what's going to come next. And so because of that, the seller has to, we call it owning the flow of information. So most sellers, when they come to these interactions, either they lack, I shouldn't say most sellers lack preparation, but often what happens is the seller abdicates responsibility for expertise to others in the organization, right? So it's common, of course, in the process of making a decision, a sales engineer, a solutions engineer, a sales manager, a product person, somebody's going to come into the process at some point and help convey expertise about your product. And what often happens is the seller kind of sets them up, brings them in the conversation, introduces them, and then recedes into the background for the next 55 minutes,
Yeah.
sort of abdicating responsibility for that to other people. And that's the opposite of owning the flow of information. What it shows the buyer is there's no reason you're here other than having set up this conversation. So the Jolt seller is contrasted very differently. So they're owning the flow of information by, first of all, being very prepared with that call partner to
Yeah.
make sure that they understand the role they're going to play. And then they're orchestrating the experience. They're really the conductor as they go along the way, bringing people into the conversation, out of the conversation. There are other things they're doing within the conversation itself, but how they own the flow of information and really the conversation itself becomes a very big factor in the degree to which that buyer feels like, hey, am I on my own or am I not on my own?
Mm.
So that's limiting the aspiration. And then finally, the T is taking risk off the table. So this is a skill that's particularly useful in places where the buyer is stuck because they feel like outcomes remain far
Yeah.
too uncertain. There's too much variance involved, too many variables, too many moving pieces involved in this decision. So in this place, the seller has to find ways to set very proper expectations, right? About what's achievable, what's believable, what's practical.
Yeah.
Too often, sellers either wait too long to do that. They wait until the buyer sets their own expectations about what they want to achieve. And then only if we start to wonder if they're getting a little bit too, out in front of themselves or their eyes are kind of too big for the stomach, do we then kind of tap the brakes. In fact, we're perfectly fine if the buyer sets outlandish, very high expectations for what can be achieved because they just then want to buy more. So what Jolt sellers are doing is early setting very proper outcome expectations about what's practical, what's achievable, what's believable. And then sometimes we may have to find ways to de-risk that decision entirely. So we talk about the use of safety nets in the process of the
Yeah.
decision. Most sellers don't use any safety nets at all, partly because they assume they're not permissioned or authorized to do it. I'm not a retail store where you can walk in with a receipt and exchange my product.
No.
And so therefore I just don't do anything. I just kind
Yeah.
of hope and pray that that kind of goes away.
What could be an example of a safety net that is that kind of a like 3 months break clause in a 12-month contract, or is it something else?
Yeah, well, so it could be those things, right? But again, the most important lesson that we talk about in our training programs is you have to have a plan, right? So first, I need to understand is the degree to which that buyer, their perception they might mess up, is it more perception or more reality? Because sometimes the buyer is correct in the assessment that what they're entering into is in fact a little risky, or there is a potential or a high consequence if things were to go wrong.
Yeah.
And so in those cases, I need to recognize that and be aware of it. But other times their perception it is more perception than reality. That the buyer, their imagination has started to run wild. And in your heart of hearts, we do this all the time. And
Mm.
so understanding whether it's more perception or reality matters in terms of the type of safety net I might go to offer and the heft of that safety net, if you will.
Mm.
But then they can achieve different things. And there are things that are simple and rather informal that I can use, offering to run a training for their team, for example, is usually a pretty simple thing that addresses that
Smart.
person's
Yeah.
personal fear. But then other times I do need to think about getting creative and working with my manager to find, are there things we can do either from a terms perspective or a contracting perspective that can take some risk off the
Mm,
table. Almost always, though, when we get into the classroom and work with teams, they're more creative than you might think. They come up with
yeah.
more safety net options than you might think. You just need to frame it up in the right way.
Yeah. I think that's a really good. Even just you can even state it out to the person you're speaking with. So I know this is a big decision. What kind of safety measures can we take here that you will end up in a situation where you don't look like a fool because you bought our product?
That's right. Yeah, exactly. And you know what? Honestly, there are more things people have in place than they think. And so sometimes it's just about taking credit for it and talking about it in those terms. So
Yeah.
mutual value plans, the customer success team, the checkpoints they might have involved. Those are forms of safety nets, or at least can be if they're positioned
Yeah.
well. They're
Right.
not the most formal of them, and they might not address actual risk, but let's not forget about talking about those things and the role they can play.
I'm also thinking a little bit about the entry point to the sales conversations. Is there any kind of impact on whether it's like a classical inbound deal where somebody comes to you, or it's like some BDR that booked the meeting for you, and how does that kind of affect your behavior? Or if it's a competitive deal where you're kind of the second one in there and the other competitor had set some expectations that now you need to navigate how you position your product against the.
Yeah.
So what is kind of like the fly into the sales conversations? How does that matter?
So, well, let me tackle those maybe one at a time.
Yeah.
So,
Fair.
the involvement of the BDR, SDR in the decision doesn't necessarily influence things one way or another. I mean, there is a role that SDR, BDR can play in making sure they're setting expectations. The form of recommendation they might make is a little different. It's not so much about the solution, but rather the experience that might come next and what have you. So when we work with SDRs, BDRs, the version of Jolt matters, but it's just a little different. I will say though that an inbound lead is often the place where the seller gets most head faked into the situation, right? Because in those inbound situations, it's often, I think, easy and maybe even correct to presume that the buyer has kind of arrived at intent to purchase on their own, right? They've kind of raised their hands. They've
Yeah.
come to us.
Yeah.
Therefore, they already kind of want this. And so my job is just to help them buy this as fast as possible. And so then it's extra confusing when the buyer gets stuck. Right. And so I think then it's like, well, maybe I was wrong about them wanting it. I'll go back to the beginning and try to reconvince them of it. But you have to remember, it's not just about them wanting it. It's also about them feeling like they're not going to mess up if they were to go down that path. So we're treating the right problem. The On the competitive front, though, the look at the way that a Jolt seller would think about things like recommendations and proper expectations is sort of like a first principles approach. And so it's going to apply even early stage when I'm trying to position us relative to other options. One might be other potential competitors, right? What's the path you're headed down? How can I bring this mindset of making great recommendations, setting proper expectations into that path type
Yeah.
recommendation? And then the last thing I'd say is that notion of being a buyer's agent, demonstrating to that buyer that you've got their best interest in mind, that they're going to have a great experience in a game of inches where you've got a close competitive fight, all things being equal,
Yeah.
the buyer's going to want to work with those people who demonstrate that buyer's agency more than anything else. So while that's not designed necessarily to win a game of selection, it does have that double benefit, if you will.
If you are to be able to offer good recommendations, the O and the Joel kind of, it also takes you understanding the classical competitive landscape that you're in and being able to accurately say, this is what they would typically say they do, this is what we do, and this is XYZ, why our solution is probably what I would recommend to you.
Well, it's even more than that, right? So a buyer's agent, when they talk about their competitors, they're quick to credit them for the things that they might do really well, right? Of course, they couch that and counter that by helping understand where we do really well, right? And when customers work well with us, they typically look like this, or they're trying to solve these. Those other people, they do a great job here. And if that's what you're looking for, by
Mm,
all means,
yeah.
right? So it's a very above board sort of way of positioning yourself relative to competitors.
Cool. Maybe if we can use this as a transition just to, for you, Ted, to give the advice to marketers you've always wished them to really internalize.
Oh
So
gosh.
you must have had a lot of salespeople complaining about marketing teams and not doing well enough in your career. So I know this is not your expertise per se, but what are the things that you should think that we as B2B marketers can take from this? What are the actions we can do to set up the sales teams in the right situations?
I mean, look, I could probably think of at least three things to start with. One is, again, not to, be too repetitive, but just understanding the role of emotion and the role that fear of messing up plays in making decisions. That, look, the collateral that we go to develop and arm sales teams with is great if it's sort of helping them from a rational business case standpoint. But if we can pair that with elements that address that fear of messing up, help understand, paint that picture about, hey, this is going to go better than you think, or this is, we've done this before, demonstrating expertise about the process, things we can do as a way to build comfort that what comes next is going to be great over and above the business case type documents that we're going to build. So that's one thing. The idea of making recommendations is something that I think the organization can help with. That there is a skill involved, and we talk to sellers about how they can construct the shopping carts, if you will, for buyers, and how they can then advocate for different elements. But if the organization is able to kind of give them a head start, if you will, by helping them identify what are some of those trade-offs that buyers might make, and what are some common sort of combinations that might make sense. Often when organizations think about this, they jump to the, sort of Netflix pricing of, good, better, best, or some sort of difference. And that can work. This is not recommendations aren't meant to be a pricing strategy or a negotiation strategy, but there are elements, so long as you're using that as a way to clarify trade-offs, I think that type of thing can work as well.
Yeah.
And then lastly, I think from a sales messaging and communication standpoint, that's probably a whole other separate conversation, about what's happening to pitch decks these days. And,
Mm.
do buyers want PowerPoint, presentations or not? The nature of the combative conversation happening between buyer and seller. But more generally, again, I would just think about, are there things we can do to enable the seller early on to discover in a way that helps me identify what path is that buyer already on, and how might I think about redirecting that from there? And to the extent to which the messaging is helping in some of that discovery process, I think all the better. And so those are kind of the three big things that come to mind.
And it makes a lot of sense. And as you're speaking, I'm also thinking about that there's probably also an element of having clearly defined ideal customer profiles for the whole company. So everybody knows who are we really trying to attract, to sell to sustain when once they become customers, who do we build product for? So that this whole motion sets sellers up to actually speak with the right types of companies and not the wrong types of companies.
Yeah, I think, it's a really good point. I mean, if you channel the conversation that a Jolt seller has at different junctures, this pops up in recommendations, it pops up in when they set expectations, it pops up even really when they're looking to limit exploration, is if they have a really sound understanding of fit, things become much easier, right? Because they're
Mm.
trying to convey, look, when companies that have great experiences work with us, they kind of look like this, or they're trying to solve these problems. And so because of that, then I can convey, hey, buyers who go down this path report back to us these things. Buyers who go down that path report to us these things. And look, if these aren't the types of problems you're looking to solve, maybe this isn't, the best fit. Maybe I should make good use of your and my time, and let's go explore other avenues.
Absolutely. Ted, this has been fantastic so far, and I feel like there's a million more questions that I can ask you, but that time is running fast. So I know Jolt Effect is not your only book. There's something seeding right now,
That's
prospering,
right.
and maybe you can tell us a bit about. So Jolt Effect obviously was a massive success, but what's the next book around the corner, and what did you study in this book?
Yeah. Well, I should mention we view Jolt as sort of an ongoing, living and breathing research exercise around how people make decisions and how we navigate conversations. People can check out sellinginnovations.com or jolteffect.com to learn more. The new book is called Activator Advantage. So this is a separate study that we engaged in over about a 2.5 year period. We worked with a company called Intap, so which is a technology provider in the professional services and financial services space. So this is a study about doer sellers inside of professional services. So if you think about a lawyer, banker, a consultant, a talent advisor, all sorts of different people, marketing consultants, for one, right? Anyone who has to both sell and execute on that piece of work.
Yeah.
Could be a founder, right? It could be a very senior person in a boutique organization, right? Doer sellers have to sell and execute on that piece of work. What do the best people do
Nightmare.
from a business development? Yeah, it's really tough. It's a tough job for sure. And partly because you're sort of a part-time seller, right? Like I have to actually go now do the things I just sold. I have to try the case or
Yeah.
run the audit or execute the project or what have you. And so what we did is a big study. We ended up, I think we've collected data now on 3,000 partners inside of professional services organizations.
Oh, wow.
Interviewed over 100 of these individuals. I did a lot of those interviews myself. Sort of understand more about why they do what they do. How do you think about your book of business? How do you think about developing relationships? How do you think about pitching for business and what have you? But built a big quantitative model, and it identified 5 different potential approaches to business development. One of those profiles we call the activator is the winning profile. And so it actually turns out to be the only one really that is positively correlated with success on an ongoing basis in these environments. And the activator is, and the book, of course, as you might imagine, goes into a lot of depth on not just the activator skills themselves, but how firms and organizations can cultivate and build those things. I'll give a brief overview as to what the activator is, but because I suspect most of the audience here is sort of in the B2B world, and not in professional services, although perhaps some of us might have second lives in consulting or what have you. And so
Yeah.
this is maybe personally interesting on that front. But there are parallels that we can talk about into purchasing in general. So the overall sort of decline in client loyalty and customer loyalty is something that we continue to observe. And more generally, as you think about positioning services, I think there's a lot of implications here. But the activator, they kind of think about them as a super connector, right? So they're trying to create this very robust network on many different dimensions, internal to their firm, external within their clients and customer organizations, and even third-party individuals who could be helpful to my network along the way. So let's imagine you're an accountant. It's useful for my clients to understand lawyers and other people that could be experts for them along the way. And I'm going to bring that expertise from them. I consider myself almost like a general contractor for expertise for people inside of my network. So there's a commitment to business development, which sounds obvious to most people in B2B sales, but in professional services isn't the default. They prefer to kind of execute their business or kind of do their thing. And so there's a regular commitment on an ongoing basis to business development.
Yeah.
They connect in great depth. So they're very diligent about their networks. They use platforms like LinkedIn, sure, but they also use events and other offline type formats as a way to really make sure that they're connecting on an ongoing basis. And then they're very creative about bringing ideas in a proactive way to people inside their network. They're very thoughtful about, hey, I thought of you because of this, and then looking to distribute out these pieces of paper. So this doesn't require necessarily writing these white papers. Shouldn't have said pieces of paper, digital pieces of paper, maybe perhaps. But yeah, so very diligent about being proactive to ideas to their clients.
I looked a bit about the article you guys put out in the Harvard Business Review as well, and read about the activator. I can really see like these modern times with with LinkedIn. If you have a really, really good activator, they can deliver immense value to your company because they can be in contact with so many people at once, sharing their advices, sharing their network, connecting with people, and growing your business in general.
Yeah, certainly. I think part of this is, and some of the classic sort of activators are those people who have very wide networks. I think, sometimes that can be a little bit intimidating to people who feel like perhaps, I'm more of an introvert or where do I start? I don't have a big network. Can I be? And so a lot of the book is, and the article to your point in Harvard Business Review is about, how can I lean a little bit harder and a little more often in that direction on a day-to-day basis? And this doesn't require or need us to have giant networks, but it can mean like, how can I be thoughtful about connecting with people, even if my network is quite small? How can I make sure that I'm in regular contact with them, bringing them proactive ideas, making sure that I'm being mindful about connecting with them between projects and between deals, and they recognize as somebody they'd look to for advice, even in those offline formats, if you will. That's an activator sort of mindset too.
Wonderful. Ted, thank you so much for taking this time to educate me and also who are listening to this show. If people want to learn more about your work, read your books,
Yeah.
follow your videos and so forth, where should they go?
Yeah, well, first, I'd love to connect with everyone on LinkedIn. So shoot me a connection request. And sellinginnovations.com, that's our business on the B2B side. So we spend all of our time trying to help other organizations replicate what we're seeing in research about what high performers are doing. So training programs, advisory programs, ways that we can help there. So reach out to learn more about that. You can find more information on the book itself at jolteffect.com. And then the Activator Advantage, you can go to dcminsights.com. That's our business that focuses on professional services.
Fantastic. Lots of pathways. And to everyone else, also, once you've done all the connection to Ted and his companies, do go follow Attributed to where you listen to podcasts, and you'll get this conversation with Ted and many others straight into your feed. Ted, once again, thank you so much for spending the time, and everybody for listening. Thank you so much for paying attention to us, and wish you a great day.
Thanks so much.
We hope you like listening to us. Subscribe to our podcast and the ones that we have been guests on.
And if you have any feedback for us, just do let us know. And should there be a guest that you think we should be talking to, then pitch us.
We're looking forward to seeing you.